Hello, my name is Julie Noblet, and I'm Community Manager for the Diagram Center here at Benetech. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar called Office Hours with the Image Description Experts. Our presenters today will be Geoff Freed, Bryan Gould, and Madeleine Rothberg of the National Center on Accessible Media at WGBH in Boston. Today's session, you have sent us in your toughest image description challenges, and without any further ado, let me turn the microphone over to Geoff Freed, who will set about answering them.
Thanks, Julie. Hi, everybody. This is Geoff Freed from the National Center for Accessible Media at the WGBH Educational Foundation in Boston. I and my colleagues are going to spend the next hour answering some questions that were submitted ahead of time regarding image descriptions. We collected a number of questions and images which we've included in this presentation. Some examples of tough stuff, some difficult to describe images and charts and graphs, and we will deliver information about approaches that you can use for these images. We won't necessarily be giving to you full descriptions of each one of the images or diagrams. There will be partial descriptions, but mostly we'll be giving you information about how to describe these kinds of things so that you'll have the ammo to do it yourselves. And we'll take questions as we go along and answer them as we get them, and also we'll have some time at the end for some Q&A. So with that in mind, let's move on to the first question, which was about schematic drawings. Someone made the point that schematics can often be complicated and difficult to describe, and are there any best practices? There are, in fact, some best practices that I will mention now, and which will be referred to as we go through the presentation, a set of guidelines that we published here in NCAM a couple of years ago about describing complex science and math images for digital talking books. The information that I'll be telling you now and that Bryan and Madeleine will be telling you later can all be found in these guidelines, and there will be a link to those as well. But one of the best ways to think about descriptions for schematic diagrams is to provide a brief summary, and then you can usually break a schematic down into a list, an ordered list or an unordered list as it's applicable. Some types of schematics can be, if they're simple enough, can be just summarized in a brief paragraph, maybe two, without resorting to a list. So what we can do is show you examples of both. On the screen here you see a schematic of a simple circuit with a switch, and that would be the brief summary. Schematic diagram of a simple circuit with a switch, and then I've broken this one down into 3 bullets. The first one is 3 batteries form a power pack. Each battery is represented by a pair of long positive and short negative lines. A wire representing a straight line leaves the positive terminal of the power pack, connects to a toggle switch, which is in the open position, and the open switch is represented as a break in the wire lifted at a diagonal. And then the final bullet, the wire continues to a light, which is represented by a zigzag line with a circle around it, and then back to the negative terminal of the power pack. Somebody has asked a question that says the diagram starts with the positive terminal of the power pack, of the battery. Is this designated by the longer line in the symbol? And the answer is yes. In a schematic drawing about electricity, batteries are represented by pairs of parallel lines, a long and a short. And the long line is positive and the short line is negative. Okay, so that's an example of a longer description. But for this same schematic, we can, I think, also summarize it briefly in a paragraph. A schematic diagram of a simple circuit with a switch. The circuit is composed of 3 batteries, a toggle switch, and a light. The switch is in the open position. Now, obviously, these 2 descriptions have distinct purposes. The first one, I'll put that back up, would be aimed at someone or a classroom or an audience that is not necessarily familiar with schematics because we're describing the symbols. But the second one, on the other hand, would be aimed at someone who is familiar with schematics, where we don't describe what a battery looks like, what a switch or a toggle or a light looks like. we simply summarize the schematic for them. So those are two ways that you can approach schematics. One other question here about this, about lists. Someone is asking, when lists are used, how is that captured in alt text and expressed to the user? Well, lists can be provided as markup, unordered lists, list items, things like that. If you're providing them in HTML, if you're providing lists using LongDesk or something like ARIA described by, again, that's markup, so you can provide those using regular markup, using regular list markup. Okay, that's it for schematics, and I'll turn it over now to Bryan.
All right, hello. We have the next complex image is from a biology textbook, and this is an example of both, a complex image and one that it has deals with 3 dimensions. So here we are. This is interesting because at first glance, these are very complex images, the one on the left and the right, but as we will dive in a little deeper, we'll find that there's actually quite a bit of information in the captions and then in the figure explanation down below. But let's go over the basic guidelines for describing this type of image that you would go to, regardless of what the complex image is. We always want to summarize the illustration briefly and then provide details. Use a drill-down method of providing information in overall summarization and then increasingly complex details. If colors used to convey information, include that in the description. Otherwise, don't include design or color details. In this case, we will talk about color, but just briefly. If appropriate, include information about shape and relative size. If the image includes data in the form of a chart or a graph, present that data as a data table. That won't happen in this case, but the next image, or in 2 images, we'll have an example of that. Include the text of the photo caption if the text is contained within the image as opposed to being provided as true text. And so let's start with that one. In this case, we will make the assumption that the caption below each image is accessible to a screen reader. And that could be done in 2 ways, either as being included as a caption in the code, in the markup, or simply as text that appears below the image and is associated with the image that way. Other times, you may find an image that when you click on it, you'll find that the text is actually part of the image and therefore not accessible to the screen reader. And it'll be the job of the alt text writer to determine whether or not the caption information is available separately or will have to be copied and included in the alt text. Okay, so for this one, we're saying that it's available separately from the image. So in other words, what we have here, the breakdown of what we're looking at here is an image of this purple ribbon model on the left, a image of the space filling model, the gray, blue, and red on the right. Underneath are 2 captions, which a screen reader can find and read at the appropriate time. And then we have a figure description below. So, as I said, when you look at these, they might be a little, they might seem daunting, but let's read them in context. The first one, a ribbon model. First of all, ribbon is already nice and descriptive. Shows how the single polypeptide chain folds and coils to form the functional protein. So there's already descriptive language in the caption, which isn't always the case, and it's very helpful because you want to build on that and you don't want to repeat it necessarily. And then we see that the yellow lines are mentioned as well, so we need to include that in our description. When we look at the one on the right, the space filling model, one of the words there that we pointed out is globular shape, which is fantastically descriptive and again is already providing sort of a mental picture and a description of what the space filling model is before we even write our alt text. And then if we've just pointed out down in the figure description, the word groove, which is also appears in both images, so we have to mention that in the description too and say in context why it's important. We don't need to talk about function. That's the job of the figure description and the captions. What the job of the alt text is to describe the pictures in context. So let's look at what we've come up with here. So for those complex images, actually the description, because the captions are so complete and descriptive themselves, these are fairly short alt text. The one on the left, the ribbon model resembles a tangle of string connected in a few places with yellow lines. One section is indented and labeled groove. The one on the right, space-filling model is a grape-like cluster of gray spheres. Some of the spheres are half red or half blue. One section is indented and labeled groove. So very straightforward, focus on the visual elements, there's no real data there except for the label, groove, if you want to put it in that category. And all the other work is done by the caption text. So these are, for these sort of complex 3D images, we can use fairly straightforward short alt text, which is great for the student as well. They're not overwhelmed with more information than they need to get, and they can continue reading the text. Well, here's a simple question. How would you describe the following image? And boy, what an image. This obviously is quite complex, and this falls into the category of sometimes you just can't avoid writing very long alt text or long descriptions. There's a lot of information in these images. Again, we have this out of context, but for the purpose of this webinar, we're going to assume that these images are doing a lot of work. In other words, the surrounding text doesn't do description for them. The captions here are very simple. They're basically just titles of the images. The first one is oxygen release and carbon dioxide pickup at the tissue, so very basic, basically a label of what's happening. Then, it's up to the reader, the student, to dissect this image and figure out what's happening and look at the reactions and go from there. So again, go to our guidelines. Of course, we'll start with a summary. If color or design are used to provide information, include this in the description. Otherwise, do not include these elements in the description. And in our original description, we chose not to describe the blue and the red arrows, but someone far smarter than us pointed out that since we're dealing with blood and oxygenated cells, that blue and red should be pointed out. So it's always important to have a subject matter expert at hand and to know what it is you're looking at and the subject that you're dealing with so that you can provide the most helpful, most accurate description. We'll go back to our guidelines. Provide a description based on the intent of the image as well as the intended audience. And I will just make the point that, of course, you need to do that. This image could be being used as an example of a science image. And therefore, all of the detail, all of this intricate information is not important at all. It's simply an example of a science image. However, for the purposes of this session, we're going to assume this is appearing in a biology textbook and that everything in here is very important. So we'll go through the process of how to determine what to put in there in terms of alt text. Complex illustrations, again, can be broken down to data tables or lists. We've chosen a list format for this. It's similar to a flow chart in that we have a reaction, many reactions sort of in a list format. And we've started it here. So we've started with the top image, and here's our general summarization of what's going on. An illustration shows tissues, cells, and blood plasma separated by interstitial fluid. Arrows of various thicknesses show CO2 moving from the tissue cells into the interstitial fluid and then into the blood plasma. So we have our flow already, so we've sort of painted this initial picture. The reactions are listed. So now all that's left for us to do, and I put that in quotes, all, but what's left for us to do is to list all of these reactions. And we can just do those starting from the top to the bottom in a nested list. In fact, we don't have to be nested. It's just a bullet-pointed list format. A medium arrow shows CO2 moving from the interstitial fluid into the plasma. Then it's dissolved into the plasma. a narrow arrow shows CO2 moving from the interstitial fluid into the plasma, and then there's a reaction. So we start with the arrow, and we can add the arrow color and the relative size, and then we have the arrow, we have what's moving, in this case it's CO2, where is it going, and if there's a reaction listed, what's the reaction. And that's the format that each bullet should take as you move from top to bottom in this image all the way down. And then as you read, if you read through the lower image, while it looks like it's sort of a one-for-one, and you could just say, and then everything happens in reverse. In fact, if you look closely, it isn't exactly a one-for-one in each of the reactions, and there's some different things happening. So, again, the bottom image requires a similarly long and very sort of long and drawn-out alt text to get all of the information across. So, again, that's not a bad thing. It is what it is. We always want to shoot for brevity, and we always want to shoot for efficiency, but sometimes you have a lot of information to give. So the way you can maintain efficiency and brevity is by using the drill down method, starting with the summary, then going into your specifics, making it providing them in a list, and having each sentence, each bullet point structured in the exact same way so it's easy to read, and then so the student knows what's different in each step, what has changed, what's the new information that you're giving me for each bullet point. And then I'm going to turn the next one over to Madeleine.
Actually, before Madeleine jumps in, we have a couple of questions that I think are good to read here. Somebody's asking questions about lists. When you're providing lists in a Word document, you can use, or HTML, you can use list structure, but when you're providing a description like the ones Bryan has been talking about via a list in a PDF, in the alt text field of an image in a PDF, you can't use markup. So how do you handle a list there? There are a couple of ways you can do that. You can use an ordered list, which is to say just use numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on for each of the bullet points. If you don't want to use an ordered list and you want to use something that would be equivalent to an unordered list or a bulleted list, you can use a character like a dash to represent each bullet point. In the case of providing a description in a PDF where there's no markup, it's probably best to use an ordered list because that will help people keep better track, but you can use a dash for an unordered list as well. And someone else has asked a question about the reading order of image descriptions, about whether or not it's best to make the description read before or make it available before or after the image. And the answer to that is it kind of depends on the context, and it also depends on the markup or the technology. If you have just an image description that is attached via alt text, then most of the time the description is read after the image is identified. If, however, you have a situation like the one where Bryan was describing where you have a picture and then a photo caption below it, how that information is presented on the page will determine the reading order. Usually what will happen is if the photo caption is presented separately in terms of markup from the image, then the image will be identified. If there's any alt, it will be read, and then the photo caption will probably be next or nearly next in the reading order, and then it will be read aloud. If, however, you presented the photo and the photo caption together as a group, say in HTML, then what will most likely happen is that the image will be identified and then the photo caption will follow it immediately because it's presented as a group. But again, this depends on context. And now, Madeleine, do you want to go ahead and talk about a flowchart?
Thank you. Question number 4 is a complex flowchart that someone sent in and asked us how we would approach describing this image. And it's a quite complicated image. It looks like, we don't have the exact context, obviously, but it looks like it's about a network logon process with authentication through wireless access into a secured network. And this is similar to the schematic diagram that we saw at the beginning in that it's a set of structured information with some visuals and some text, and we need to approach it in a sort of a structured way. So as usual, we start by looking at the context. If we had it, what is the material around this visual? Is this visual only a backup? So, for example, if this visual was fully described in the text and the image is a backup for those who like to learn visually, then the description might say, diagram of network login, see section 1.1, or something along those lines. The next thing we would want to refer to from the text is whether there are any common abbreviations. So there's a lot of long terminology, and as Bryan described with the blood cells, sometimes you can't get around a long list of description to fully cover all the information that's in the image, in which case sometimes it can at least make it a little more efficient if you can use abbreviations. And we had a question of whether it's okay to make up your own abbreviations in order to improve the efficiency of the image description. And I would caution you against that. If the descriptions are not terms that are in use in the industry, then you may create confusion for the reader as they try to learn some new abbreviation on the fly. On the other hand, if you can identify abbreviations that are in common use and that are relevant, so for example here, it turns out that Network Authentication and Authorization Service is often called NAS, N-A-A-S, and Wireless Access Point is often called WAP. So you can save a whole lot of syllables using those abbreviations, and you're still helping your reader to stay current in their industry or in the field that they're trying to learn, because you're not taking them, you're not feeding them abbreviations that are not in use elsewhere. As we've seen before for complex flowcharts, we want to start with a brief overview and describes the general layout and any distinctive visual elements. And then we're going to use a list to show the progression through the image. And this image actually is very nicely numbered. So it shows a series of steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that's terrific because it gives us structure for our list of descriptions of each step. We're going to use nested lists in places where a single step has subsections that are important. And we're not going to describe visual attributes except where there's an explicit need to do so. So here's the description that we came up with, or at least the start of it. A diagram shows steps in a process. And if we had, by the way, the title, if the diagram had a title, we would use that. We would say a diagram shows the steps in the blah, blah, blah process, if we knew what the process was called. And then the description continues. The diagram has 4 main sections: wireless client, wireless access point, WAP, or WAP, network authentication and authorization service, NAS, and network resources. Each main section is divided into subsections. So what that intro has done is it's named the various parts. It's told you that there's 4 big sections and that they have subsections, and it's introduced the abbreviations that are going to be used in the rest of the description. And then we launch into the steps, and we list them with steps and numbers as they're numbered on the graph. And we attempt for each step to summarize the name of the step, which is shown on the image, as well as what's going on in that step. So step 1, certificate enrollment, connects the wireless client's certificate client to the NAS's certificate authority, which is linked by a certificate to a user in the directory. So if we go back to the image, you can see that I've just described step 1, which has a green arrow. It's labeled certificate enrollment. It connects 2 major sections in different parts of the graph. And then I explicitly listed on the right side of the screen, the little arrow that connects the certificate and the certification authority to the user in the directory. And that will come back later because that user is involved in future steps, and so on. So the approach here was to take each step one at a time, to try to be succinct, but to acknowledge that there's a lot of data, and that the only way through it is to give each step its own due. And some of the steps are long. Step 4, key agreement, has 3 subsections, so that's where we get a nested list, where we describe each subsection thoroughly in its own bullet, and so on. So an image like this is daunting, and it often takes some time to kind of work through it and try some different approaches, see what's going to work, what's not going to work, until you come to the conclusions about what creates a clear description and a description that would enable a reader to understand everything they need to learn from the image. And so now I think I'll hand it back to Bryan.
Thanks, Madeleine. Let's move. Oh, actually, before we go to the next image, we have a couple of more questions. When an image has been fully described in the main body of the text and the caption, and there's simply nothing left to say about the graphic, do you leave all text blank, or do you say something short and sweet, even if it may be redundant? And we would recommend saying something short and sweet, even if it may be redundant, even just repeating the name of the image or the shortest description, just so the reader knows that it's there. Because if it's referred to in the text and there's a caption, there should be some indication of what the image is, simply to confirm that, yes, there's an image there. And you might even say, as described in text or as described in the caption, just to let them know to have that trust between the alt text writer and the student, so they don't think they're missing anything. The only time we would recommend using a null alt or leaving the alt text completely blank would be when there's just a purely decorative image that's not referred to in any way and doesn't provide any information. And those are found frequently in textbooks, often on websites as well. Those, if it's purely decorative, then you could skip it. But if it's a meaningful image, even if it's described entirely somewhere else, it should at least be identified so the student knows that it's there, and that somebody's looked at it and determined, yes, it's been reviewed and dealt with. The second question is, when you depend on surrounding text to provide context, can you assume the reader will read all the surrounding text and not just dive in to the image? And the answer, unfortunately, is no, of course not. We have no idea what the reader is going to do. Although we don't want to make the job of reading the image description more cumbersome or take more time than it should. Really, if the text is doing all the work and the important information is there, then the image description should be really short and sweet and to the point, so the student can go and jump right back into there. And if that's the case, then when there is a longer description, hopefully the student will realize, okay, well, the image description is quite important. But it's funny, when a sighted student reads a book, often that is what has happened, that the image attracts their attention, they look at it and review it, and then maybe go back to reading. It's probably more often the opposite case for someone using a screen reader, where the screen reader will be moving along reading the main text, and then they'll be notified that there's an image or a caption in that way, and then make that decision whether or not to listen to it or continue on with the text. So, no, what we can do is do the best job of describing as effectively and efficiently as we can in context of the surrounding text and the image captions, and know that the students will read the book in whatever manner they choose. So here, I think this might be our last major image that we were sent. Anyway, how would you describe this graph? So this is a great example because it's if you've done image descriptions before, this is just two line graphs. Typically, you would make this into a data table. In fact, we'll jump right into the guidelines. These are two line graphs, which are timetables, and as we start to dissect it, you'll find out that in fact that's what they are. Begin with a brief overview, of course. Provide the title and the axis information. Convert the data in each timeline into a data table or list, which is what you would do with a line graph. And do not describe visual attributes like colors or shapes unless there's an explicit need to do so. So the interesting thing about this, the reason I love this one, is because the first reason is that usually the inset is the fine detail of a larger graph, and in this case it's reversed. We have our the top graph, the small inset, shows 10,000 years of history, years before present, and it shows three different things. It shows the time span from 10,000 years ago to today. The vertical axis shows us the estimated population over that period of time. And then we have different points. We have different events that have happened during the points. We have pyramids and Confucius and Christ and Muhammad and the fall of Rome. And so we have the details in there. And then the larger graph is actually the fine detail, only the last 500 years, and there's many more events that are listed there. And so if you were to turn this into a data table, you would find that you would have many, many blank cells because, especially in the smaller inset, the population grows very, very small, very, very slowly. And you have very few events up until the end, up until 2,000 years ago. So it would be hard to construct a data table that would be very helpful. It wouldn't, the narrative of this timeline is better presented as a list. And sometimes that's only determined by trial and error. Many times, I'll be frank, I have created either a data table or a list and then discovered this is the wrong approach, and that, in fact, you have to use the other approach to create a more straightforward description. And sometimes experience helps you skip that trial and error, but not always. So here we have figure 19.2, world population growth, 10,000 BP to 2000 AD. There are two graphs. And so here's the summary for the first graph, and you have a similar one for we have them both in this paragraph. In the first graph, the horizontal axis measures years before present, and the vertical axis measures estimated population in billions. From 10,000 years ago, the population is very small and gradually rises to 500 million until just before present, when it suddenly shoots up to 5 billion. So that's the story. We've really described that small inset very succinctly, and that's everything that happens except for those fine details. The second graph shows the details of the last 500 years. Events are marked on both graphs. For the first graph, here we are back to the first, the events are listed below as a timeline. And then what we've done is converted this line graph into a timeline. So we have 10,000 years ago, or 10,000 years before present, population just above zero. And then as we have a significant date or we have one of these events that are highlighted, we just mark them down as a timeline. The Ice Age ends, 8,000 years before present, early humans in Patagonia. Pyramids, approximately 4,500 years before present. So that's, in fact, if you're looking at this graph, that's how you read it. And that's how the information is most easily accessed, or really what the point is. And I think probably, if you want to think about the design process, the reason it was done as a line graph and not as a timeline visually is because it's so striking, just the end of the curve, how sharp it is in the last 100 years or so, the population growth. And we do the same thing in our first summary where we explain there's this massive rise of population in the last 100 years or in the very end. So there's the same effect. It's just done in a narrative way as opposed to a visual way. And then we provide the information and then the rest of the details in that way. And this isn't all of it, of course. This is the first graph, and then there would be a similar timeline, a bullet list with all the events and dates and significant population changes for that larger graph as well for the same. So you have two sets of lists to describe this image. I'll turn it over to Geoff.
All right, thanks, Brian. That is it for the images and questions that we received beforehand. Well, actually, there are a few more questions. They weren't accompanied with images, and they're here on the screen, and they mostly have to do with recommendations and guidelines. People wanting to know where they can find a basic list for reference about creating images of all kinds, science, social science, arts, math, things like that. Are there recommendations for descriptions for graphics? Are there stock descriptions that are available for specifically math, specific things in math like coordinate planes and line plots and things like that. And then what about non-science images like political cartoons and photographs and paintings and museum settings and things like that? And we'll answer those by way of showing you some guidelines, or links to guidelines at least, that are available. And you'll be able to download this slide deck yourself afterward and follow the links here. But the set of guidelines that we've been referring to and that we used in preparing this presentation are called Effective Practices for Description of Science Content Within Digital Talking Books, or DTBs. These are the guidelines that we published here in NCAM a couple of years ago. They're very comprehensive, and they deal a lot with complex images, and the principles described there can be applied to any image or graphic, not just those aimed at DTBs. So that is a good place to start. At the W3C, there is a document that is not quite final, but it's close enough to be very useful. It's called Techniques for Providing Useful Text Alternatives Using New Markup Found in HTML5. That's a good document to take a look at as well. There are some tutorials at WebAIM about creating accessible images. And then, of course, at the Diagram Center, there are a couple of good sources. You can start by taking a look at previous webinars that we've presented about image descriptions and accessible math. If you follow the link for the webinars archive, there are about half a dozen now that are available, 1-hour sessions, 90-minute sessions that are very detailed about descriptions and other things too. So take a look there. And while you're there, you can investigate a tool that Diagram has made available called Poet, which is used for describing images in DAISY books, in DTBs, and soon will be available for providing descriptions in EPUB 3 documents. So take a look at that. Those are not guidelines. Poet is actually a tool for writing descriptions for DTBs and soon EPUBs. If you're in need of information about tactile graphics, take a look at the American Printing House for the Blind for their library, their image library. They have a lot of information there about tactiles. And then since math often comes up when we're talking about images, there are several resources for creating accessible math. The first resource is actually MathML, which is not necessarily a way to provide descriptions for images of math, but we like to promote the use of MathML because it's the best way to present math. Instead of a picture of math, you actually use markup to present math. MathML's adoption has been accelerated lately because it was incorporated into HTML5, and so embedding MathML into, say, a web page is a lot easier than it used to be, and as a result, people are doing it more. The good news is that assistive technology like screen readers, in combination with various browsers, people can actually access MathML much more effectively than they could even just a couple of years ago. If you are, however, interested in providing images of math, or if you need to, can't use MathML, there are specific ways and approaches and a vocabulary for describing math in an unambiguous manner. A good place to learn about that is at GH, where they hosted the MathSpeak initiative a few years ago. There you will find a huge library of terminology and approaches for describing math unambiguously. There's an excellent article by Steve Noble from the University of Louisville called What are the Technology Issues Involved in Making Math Accessible? I highly recommend reading that for a good summary of the problem. And then a specific diagram webinar that was presented a few months ago called Tools for Creating Accessible Math. It's about 90 minutes long, and it talks all about the different ways you can create math in an accessible manner. And then finally, there's a set of guidelines they're called the Guidelines for Accessible Assessments Project, or the GAP project. This is a draft document. It's not quite final, but it provides a lot of information about describing math and English language arts in assessments, not necessarily for textbooks, but for assessments. There is information there about in terms of math, how to describe and present symbols, numbers, plots, stem and leaf diagrams, things like that, expressions. And then somebody mentioned, what about cartoons and things like that? Well, you can find information here in the GAP guidelines about maps and cartoons and artwork, timelines as well. And so that's a good place to look for information. And speaking of describing art, since it's not something that many people are familiar with, I thought we'd end with a sample of that. Here we have a painting done by, I believe, a 10-year-old, and it was presented by Very Special Arts in Florida with an audio description, and I thought I would play that audio description for you now.
Stop 1. Woman with Messy Hair was created in 2001 by Jorge Hernandez, a 10th grade student at Barbara Goldman Senior High School in Miami, Florida. The medium is an Indian ink washout technique. The work measures 32 inches high by 23 inches wide. A young woman with green eyes stands sideways, staring intently out over her right shoulder, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. Her unsmiling lips are parted and her arms crossed. 2 long yellow feathers dangle from a round clip in her disheveled red hair, which juts out from her head in floppy clumps. The right sleeve of her tattered yellow blouse appears torn, baring her shoulder. A large white circle set into a plain gray background, resembling a full moon in the twilight sky, frames her head. Inky streaks and smudges cover the entire canvas, marring the woman as well as the world around her.
So that's an example of a description for a painting, and I should correct myself. That wasn't painted by a 10-year-old. It was painted by a 10th grader. And that's about it. There's some contact information I can give you as well. If you want to take a look at the diagram website, if you go to diagramcenter.org, you can find information all about the diagram project, as well as links to all of the webinars and the other tools we've mentioned. And if you take a look at the NCAM website, which is ncam.wgbh.org, you'll find links there to some of the other guidelines we talked about as well, and other information about NCAM. And with that, I will turn it back to Julie.
Thank you, Geoff, and thank you to all three of you, Geoff, Bryan, and Madeleine, for a really fantastic presentation. I want to thank the participants as well who sent in some really fantastic examples of complex images for us to talk about today. We offer these webinars quarterly, so please, as Geoff mentioned, take a look at the diagram site on the webinars page to see what has gone before, and stay tuned for future webinars coming up. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Please stand by.